So if we talk about muscle training, for example, hypertrophy, we still have no idea what the hell's going on. So we know which buttons to push, but that's just empirical knowledge. That's not the understanding of the cell. There are a great many ways of getting strong. Some of them very good, some of them mediocre, some of them very bad. But historically in lifting sports, the two systems that have been predominant are the Soviet weightlifting system. So the story is this. This method, the Soviet Olympic weightlifting method, was developed over several decades by a number of coaches, by a number of scientists. So it's a very much collaborative effort. So Vorobyov was one for sure, Medvedev, Chernyak, a number of others. And it was a very, before even dissecting this method, let me tell you how successful this method was. You can look up the world weightlifting records in Olympic weightlifting. And you hear about all these different records set by this lifter, that lifter, and so on and so forth. Few people realize that the International Weightlifting Federation has changed the weight classes at 2 or 3 times since the 80s. And the reason they did that is to erase the record set by the drug-taking athletes back then. Of course, Joe, I'm very happy that as soon as they changed the weight classes, lifters stopped taking drugs like that. So if you look at these records, kilo per kilo, pound per pound, and if you chart them, compare them to what they did then, to what they do today, you will find that while they did catch up in a few weight classes, in about half of these classes, the records from the 80s still stand. So for example, what Yuri Vardanyan did in 1980 at 82 kilos, he totaled 400 kilos in the snatch and the clean and jerk. That's never been done before. And Yuri Vardanyan was a wiry guy. You wouldn't even take him for a lifter. Just amazing. So, first of all, the system still remains. If we were just take a very large, big picture, 50,000 foot look at strength, there are a great many ways of getting strong. Some of them very good, some of them mediocre, some of them very bad. But historically in lifting sports, the two systems that have been predominant are the Soviet weightlifting system and the American classic powerlifting system from the 70s and 80s, okay? So that was kind of a long detour before I tell you why the stuff that they figured out back in 1960s, why it matters, just to say it still is the best, it still rules. So what they did was very empirical. For example, when you're studying endurance, going into the cell, studying the biochemistry of the cell in the body, taking it apart, figuring out how this works is very helpful, very. On the other hand, when you're dealing with strength, that approach has been not really effective. So if we talk about muscle training, for example, hypertrophy, we still have no idea what the hell's going on. So we know which buttons to push, but that's just empirical knowledge. That's not the understanding of the cell.
So we really don't understand hypertrophy? Really?
No, we do not.
Wow.
No. And I'll be happy to talk about this, but if you don't mind, let me just finish on this variable overload and the Soviet weightlifting system. So what they did, even though they also, they cut the muscle, look at that as well, just didn't learn as much. But coaches programmed particular loads for athletes and watch what happened. And then they watched how the athletes performed, and they watched how the top athletes performed. And they looked for patterns. And they were very open-minded. So they're not thinking like, well, it's got to be just the heaviest weights will do that. Or it's got to be the training to failure is going to do that. It's not the case. So just to give you an example of how enormous that undertaking was. So typical strength training study is what? 6 weeks for some untrained college subjects. Guys who are just on their phones. Professor Medvedev, who's also a world champion, he studied the training loads of top weightlifters only when they were successful in competition for 4 Olympic cycles. 4. So we're talking about 16 years. And then somebody else did it for another cycle. And there were just an amazing patterns just emerged. So for instance, I'm going to give you a rundown of what the patterns are. There are certain optimal volumes, how much exercise you do. There are certain optimal intensities. So if you follow the variable overload method, the optimal intensity, so the average intensity would be about 75% of your max, which for most people would be probably somewhere like 8 reps or something you could do, maybe 10, maybe 8. And you will see that about half of all the lifts that you do are about 75-80%. Now, where do all the other lifts come in? So there's a normal distribution. So you'll find that 75-80% are on the top, 80-85 a little bit lower, So the lighter weights, like 60%, are on the bottom. And the heavy weights, like 90% and higher, are on the bottom as well. So they figured out you just have to do most of your work with these average weights. They're not so light, so you're going to respect them, but they're not so heavy that you have any question about lifting them correctly. So, and then there's another aspect of intensity is just doing some heavier lifts, a very carefully measured number of heavy lifts in addition, like 90% or whatever, occasionally. Then they figured out the proper volumes. Just to give you an idea, if you're looking at, let's say, you might be doing 30 reps of given exercise per session, what have you, although there's variability. But then there's also something else that's very interesting, is the optimal number of repetitions with a given weight. And this is what hurts people's heads. If you look at the weights from 70 to 90%, the optimal number of repetitions are 1/3 to 2/3 of your maximum. So let me give an example to the reader, to the listener. Let's say that you're lifting a 10 rep max weight. So you go all out as hard as possible. You can do 10 reps. In training, you should be doing 3 to 6 reps. That's it. That's the window. And why is that? And we have no idea. But the scientists, like in this case, I think it was Matveev who was involved in that, the father of periodization. I think it was one of the scientists. They experimented with all sorts of rep ranges. And they figured out that if the reps are too low with a given weight, you don't get stronger. If the reps get too high, either the athlete gets hurt, or his technique is compromised, or he's just unable to perform the optimal volume. So pretty much roughly, you're looking at doing about half of the reps you're capable of. That's it. And people can argue with this all they want. Like, what's the science behind this? There's no science. We don't know. The science is purely empirical. This particular method is purely empirical. It worked for decades. It still does. And that's one of the ways you can get strong. So in summary, we have step loading, which is where you stay with the same weight for a while, or the same reps, whatever, and then make a sudden jump. That's the best way to train for beginners, usually. We have wave loading, or cycling, which is we build up, jump back, and build up again. And we have variable loading, which is almost chaotic. We're just constantly surprise the body with what we're throwing at it, but we do that within very narrow parameters.